2003's Hulk for the Sony PlayStation 2 is, much like its protagonist, a game bound by duality. Its dual nature is present in both its status as a movie and comic book tie-in, as well as in its gameplay, which offers two distinct but intertwined game styles during its runtime. Does it manage to integrate these aspects of its nature, like Smart Hulk? Or are its parts in conflict with each other like Hulk and Banner? This is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not widely considered classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. Hulk, while a movie tie-in game, attempted something unique for movie tie-in games of the time, perhaps because of its dual nature as a comic book movie game. It doesn't simply retell the events of the movie, as the previous year's Spider-Man, another comic book movie tie-in game from Activision, infamously did. I say infamously because the game released a month before the film, spoiling the plot of the movie. Instead, Hulk offers a sequel of sorts. Well, okay, maybe it would be more apt to call it a follow-up rather than a sequel? Let me explain. Hulk, the movie, served as an origin story for the Green Goliath, starring Eric Bana as Bruce Banner, Jennifer Connelly as Betty Ross, Sam Elliott as her father, General Thunderbolt Ross, and Nick Nolte as David Banner, Bruce's father. The film was so much more than just an origin story or a simple comic book movie, though, which made it somewhat of a divisive experience for audiences. Instead of a standard, by-the-numbers superhero flick, what moviegoers got was a complex examination of generational trauma, PTSD, domestic violence, borderline and split personality disorder, toxic masculinity and its relationship to American militarism, and more, wrapped in a structure that is equal parts Greek tragedy and Universal monster movie. Appropriate considering the film was being made for Universal. These are all aspects intrinsic to the Hulk character, and have been since the 60s. But the problem was that the movie was just marketed as big green rage monster goes smashy smashy for 2 hours. In other words, a standard by-the-numbers superhero flick. This led to, let's call it misled expectations for audiences. I, however, will defend this movie until the day I die. Seriously, I could go on about the film all day long. Please stop me. This is supposed to be a video about the game, not the movie. Anyway, because Universal was banking heavily on the film's success, it was, to that point, the most expensive movie Universal had ever made, coming in at $137 million. There was a massive merchandising push to go along with the film. Board games, soundtracks, playing cards, so-called PAL-sized puzzles, clothes, a voice-changing mask, mega muscles, Valentine's cards, sticker books, promo deals with Burger King and 7-Eleven, color-changing Jell-O pudding, and the best piece of Hulk merchandise ever in the form of Hulk hands. Huh, you know, looking back at it, maybe, just maybe, marketing a movie about generational trauma and PTSD squarely at kids wasn't the best approach. Just a thought. Oh, right, and of course there was the video game. The game, while clearly tied to the movie, doesn't take the same approach to the character as the movie does. At least not to the intense, introspective level as the film. The game does take some cues from the film. It picks up a year after the movie's ending, referring to the ending of the film which found Bruce Banner in an unspecified part of South America, and it features Eric Bana reprising his role as Banner. There's also the bit in the intro which offers the devs' take on the mirror dream sequence from the film. The game definitely leans more towards making good on the promises made by the film's marketing though. There is a lot of Hulk smashing, but that doesn't mean that it's simplistic or that smashing is all there is to the game. The developers took an interesting, if not entirely successful, approach to the source material, both movie and comics, in an attempt to synthesize the two. Speaking of the developer, that would be Radical Entertainment, who... Wait, this feels really familiar. Oh, right. We just covered this in the last video on The Divide. Doing 2 videos on Radical Entertainment developed games back to back was unintentional, but hey, it works. Anyway, at this point, Radical was still working on licensed games, but in 2003, in addition to pumping out the first of 3 CSI games for Ubisoft, they had Hulk in development alongside the greatest Simpsons game of all time, Simpsons Hit and Run. That might explain why the story in Hulk is not as let's call it cohesive, as it could be. Ordinarily, at this point, we'd throw up a spoiler alert warning, but there really isn't much to spoil. The basic plot deals with Banner getting the help of Professor Crawford, an old colleague and mentor of his, in order to rid himself of the Hulk by siphoning off his gamma energy using a device called a gamma orb. Crawford uses Banner's siphoned gamma energy to become Ravage, another smashy monster like the Hulk, just smarter. So far so good, right? Well, things kind of fall apart from here. Next, Hulk encounters Half-Life, an energy vampire from the comics which, okay, cool, but where did he come from? Why does he exist in the world of the movie? He's never given any backstory or even explanation. He's just bad guy who drains Hulk's health. From there, Betty Ross is held hostage in Alcatraz by Madman, who, as with Half-Life, isn't given any backstory or explanation for how he became a giant reddish monster, or how, or even why, he captured Betty, or anything like that. Hulk rescues Betty, but not before she's infected by the Hulk's gamma energy from the gamma orb. She has him take her to a military base where she is she actually cured? The game is never really clear on this. It just sort of takes it for granted that we know this because we've progressed further in the game. But yeah, after she's maybe cured, and the Hulk escapes from the military base by fighting Flux, another character from the comics who gets zero explanation for his existence, or how the military was able to emulate Banner's condition, he returns to Alcatraz and is transported to the leader's base because, sure, why not? I mean, if Madman, Half-Life, and Flux can exist here without any origin, backstory, or explanation, why not just throw the leader, the Hulk's greatest nemesis, in with no context for good measure? Anyway, Hulk defeats Leader, as he does, and escapes from the leader's self-destructing base. Cue end credits. If that story recap sounds like a confused, jumbled mess, that's because it is. Part of that is because of the characters who never really get backstories or explanations, though. There's more going on with them than just big monsters smash each other real hard, and explaining that would have added some much-needed context to the story the game tries to present. See, each of the boss characters in the game would be, or likely is, familiar to Hulk fans, just not fans of the movie. They were all plucked from the prior 15 years of the comic, in order, it would seem, to flesh out the experience on offer. For example, Professor Crawford, /Ravage, was introduced in Rampaging Hulk in 1998. Okay, fine, he gets the most characterization of anyone in the game outside of, well, Hulk, so the game gets a pass for that one. Flux and, by extension, General Riker are similar though in that they were both introduced in the comics in 2000, with Riker creating Flux in a gamma bomb test. The thing is, the game could have done so much more with the Riker-Flux dynamic. Riker just comes across as obsessed with hunting the Hulk in the game, but again, it never explains why, or why he's replaced General Ross. In the comics though, Riker is obsessed with capturing the Hulk because he's convinced that the Hulk holds the cure for his wife's cancer, an idea that would have tied in perfectly with the movie's version of the Hulk's origin. Flux, as a result, was an unfortunate victim of Riker's obsession. When I said that he was created in a gamma bomb test, I meant that he was an unwilling, not to mention unwitting, test subject. Honestly, the parallels between Riker and Flux and the movie's version of Bruce Banner and his father David would have made for an interesting game narrative in and of itself. Half-Life, on the other hand, is perhaps the game's deepest comic book cut, considering the character was introduced in 1987 and looks much different than he does in the game. I can kind of understand the changes made though. In the comics, he's a gamma-powered energy vampire who is actively decomposing the entire time Hulk fights him. Madman is almost as deep a cut, showing up in the comics in 1989. His presence actually makes sense in regard to the game's story because he's the leader's brother. He was introduced in the form that players see in the game in 1993's issue 407. The thing is, while he plays subordinate to the leader in the game, he and the leader were the deadliest of enemies in the comic. I'm not entirely sure why they changed that, or why they neglect to mention his relationship to the leader though. Now, inserting movie-fied characters from the comics isn't unheard of. Again, the Spider-Man movie tie-in game did it the year before with Shocker, Vulture, Scorpion, and, if you had the Xbox version, Kraven the Hunter. The Hulk's Rogues Gallery, though, is, let's be nice and call it less iconic. Outside of the leader, who appears here, Absorbing Man, whose role David Banner stepped into in the movie, and Abomination, who one can only assume was being saved for the movie sequel that never happened, things start getting pretty thin. You've got, who? The UFOs? I mean, they appeared in the abysmal PS1 game, despite the fact that I can't find any footage of them because no one, including myself, wants to play through that travesty long enough to find them. Then there's also Tyrannus, I guess? Maybe? So yeah, including more characters from the comics, especially more recent comics, makes sense. What doesn't make sense is why they aren't properly introduced, or explained, or given proper characterization. Maybe the explanation lies with the writer for the game? The game's story was penned by Jeff Hoole, who worked internally for Radical at the time, and, well, I guess there's a reason that Radical would get longtime Hulk writer Paul Jenkins to write the story for Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction. Hoole and the rest of Radical Entertainment seem to just assume that the player is going to be intimately familiar with the lore of the Hulk's comics coming into this game. To be fair, if this were a game solely based on the comics, that would be a more reasonable expectation. It'd still be a good idea to give some sort of character introduction, but just taking for granted that players would know these characters would be more understandable. As it stands, however, this game was supposed to be a tie-in to the movie, and considering the mixed reactions there, it's safe to wager that a lot of people coming to the game aren't going to have an encyclopedic knowledge of Hulk comics. Instead, it feels more like Radical was covertly making a straight-up comic book game instead of a proper movie tie-in, which is kinda clever, but also more than a little frustrating in that, again, they could have done so much more than they did. Okay, so the story caters more to hardcore comic book fans than people who saw the movie, but what about the gameplay itself? Well, fittingly for Hulk, the gameplay feels like an evolution of the Marvel beat-em-ups from the early 90s. Games like Konami's X-Men, Sega's Spider-Man, and Capcom's The Punisher. Sure, there were attempts to bring this style of game into the 3D polygon arena during the PS1 era, most famously or infamously with Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker and Star Wars Episode I Jedi Power Battles, which, yikes. Here though, it feels like the devs got a 3D beat-em-up right. The player has access to a weak and heavy attack, a grab, and a jump, and all of these moves can be combined for more attacks. It's not overly complex or overwhelming though. Devil May Cry, this is not. You know what though? That's okay actually. Hulk isn't exactly known for his finesse, so giving him more of a blunt object fighting style is actually in keeping with the character. What's particularly cool is that the game works in the notion that the madder Hulk gets, the stronger Hulk gets. The movie did this visually by literally showing Hulk increase in size as he gets angrier. Here though, he gets a rage meter which, when filled, sends him into gamma rage mode. This meter fills when taking damage, when attacking, or through color-coded pickups dropped by enemies. While in a gamma rage, all of Hulk's attacks are stronger, and the player has the option of using one of two area-clearing attacks. Wait, hold on a minute. A strong and weak attack, a rage mode, fighting a bunch of monsters in a 3D beat-em-up. Did God of War crib notes from Hulk as well as Rygar? Right, moving on. There is something interesting going on with the regular fights throughout the game as well. See, Hulk will fight rank-and-file soldiers, tanks, gamma-powered soldiers, and gamma dogs right out of the movie, and the comics. The thing about these encounters is that the enemies are endless. They will keep coming at the player in waves, no matter how many of them you defeat. On the surface, this just sounds frustrating, and it can be, but it's actually in keeping with the character as well as the movie's themes. Essentially, the military endlessly hounds Hulk, never leaving him alone, and forcing the player to just run because otherwise neither the Hulk nor the player would ever be able to make progress or stop fighting. In setting the game up this way, the devs force the player to experience this hounding and the frustration associated with it. Hulk smash, sure, but Hulk also just wants to be left alone. There is a problem here though, and it's one that superheroes of Hulk's power level have had issues with across any video game adaptation. A life meter. This is something we talked about in the Superman Shadow of Apocalypse video, but it applies equally here. To be fair, having the Hulk take damage makes sense in the context of the movie. He could deflect standard firearm bullets no problem, but things like tank shells would actually hurt him. Here's the thing though, he would regenerate after taking that damage in the movie, so the regenerating health bar from Shadow of Apocalypse would be a good fit here. Instead, it seems like the devs were just really generous with the health pickups as a way of compensating. It doesn't totally fix the problem, because Hulk can still get taken down by ordinary soldiers with ordinary guns if he hangs around for enough waves of them to overwhelm him, but it is a way of addressing the situation. Oh, speaking of those tank shells, the player can actually deflect them back at the tank that shot them in the first place, which, on the surface, sounds really cool and like satisfying comeuppance. The problem here is that the deflection is very precisely timed, and if you miss that timing, Hulk just, well, takes a shell to the chest. If you don't have the timing down perfectly, especially while trying to escape Gamma Base, where there are waves of tanks coming at you, the shells will end your game very quickly. It might seem like a minor thing at first, but when you're facing tanks, and Gamma soldiers, and Gamma dogs, it can get very frustrating. And yet, this isn't all there is to the gameplay. Remember, the Hulk is nothing without Bruce Banner, and the devs knew that this was the case. So, in an effort to present a full Hulk experience, they offer up areas where the player takes control not of Hulk in full rage mode, but of Banner trying to use his intelligence in the face of opposing forces. Banner is treated differently here than he has been in past Hulk games though. For instance, he didn't even show up as himself in the PS1 game. That was all Smart Hulk's show. In the 16-bit Incredible Hulk game from US Gold, he was either just a means to access tiny out-of-the-way areas that Hulk couldn't because he was too large, or as a punishment for taking too much damage. Here, though, Banner isn't a punishment or an incidental game mechanic. Instead, he has to sneak past enemies in order to accomplish his more complex level goals. Okay, sure, this seems like the type of shoehorned stealth segments everyone was throwing into their games after the success of Metal Gear Solid 2 and Splinter Cell, but it actually makes sense here for a couple of reasons. For one, it highlights the difference between Banner and the Hulk. Banner needs to avoid enemies that Hulk would just smash. Even when Banner is disguised as a soldier in Gamma Base, he has to avoid getting too close to anyone in case they realize that he is too puny to be an actual soldier. That doesn't mean he can't try to fight. Getting spotted isn't an instant game over. Fighting takes a lot out of Banner though, and he can only take a few hits before all is lost. And that's the most interesting part of these Banner segments. See, when Banner's health bar goes down, and it makes much more sense for Banner to have a health bar, he isn't knocked unconscious or killed. He turns into the Hulk. Because the Hulk is just brute force and unthinking destruction, that is an unacceptable outcome for the more nuanced goals Banner has to achieve, despite the Hulk being able to fly a plane in the 70s TV show for some reason. The subtext of this is that Banner knows he has anger management issues, and that these issues, left unchecked, have the potential to prevent him from doing things like saving himself and Betty, or properly thwarting the leader's plans. Unfortunately though, enough people apparently complained about the Banner sections of the game, because there wasn't enough smashing, that including a playable Banner was scrapped when Radical started developing Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction. Hulk for the PS2 manages to make the player feel not only like the Hulk in its gameplay, but Bruce Banner as well. While the story definitely has issues and doesn't really tie into the movie it's representing, the fact that the devs used the opportunity offered to test run a full-on, lore-steeped comic book Hulk game shows their love for the character and his history. Moreover, it managed to crack the problem of bringing the beat-em-up genre into 3D, something that hadn't really been done to that point. Despite the flaws present, the game manages to bring all of these elements together to make for a good weekend rental.